Hey, good morning to the Deep chairs. I don't see your slides in the slide set for the session. Are you guys all set with your slides?
Hey, Glenn. Yeah, we're all set.
Okay,
Yep.
just wanted to make sure everything was okay. And I didn't need to approve anything for you.
Well, I got a travel voucher you can approve.
It's so approved. And put a little something on for yourself on that.
Awesome.
I
Thanks.
had no other powers to actually pay it, but I approve it.
You're in the same boat I am. Yeah, we'll get started in about another minute or so.
So, okay. This is a pre-announcement before the chairs will open the working group. So this is combined Deprive ADD working group meeting. The chairs are all remote. So Alexander and myself are delegates just to make sure that if there's something unfortunately happens, we can jump in and help them out. But it's run by the chairs remotely. And please scan the quad code because we use it also as the blue sheets. So please register yourself. And again, if you want to go to the mic, raise your hand on your mobile app. Thank you.
All right, why don't we go ahead and get started? As Benno said, this is the joint meeting between Deprive and AD, and I'm Brian Haberman, along with Tim. We're the co-chairs of Deprive, and first want to thank Benno and Alex for taking our spots at the front of the room. They're probably doing all the hard work, and we get to sit in our offices and just rattle off on different topics. Next slide, please. Just as a note, we do have the Jabber room going through Meet Echo, so feel free to have whatever back channel conversations you want to have. Eric is probably floating around somewhere. He is our AD who keeps us in line. I don't know how. And the minutes are at that link. Tim will be keeping the minutes, but he will always appreciate any additions to those minutes as we move along. Next slide, please. Note given that this is Thursday, the IETF meeting, I hope everybody has seen this and read these documents. It's basically giving you all the process guidelines for how we operate and the things that you have to understand about IETF policy. So if you haven't read these, please go read them, especially the code of conduct. Next slide, please. I'm not going to read these. These are just called out so that everybody understands, what we're asking as we move through the meeting. One key thing here that I'm going to highlight, though, is the make sure that you identify yourself when you're speaking with this hybrid mode. Making sure people both, on Meet Echo and in the meeting room know who's speaking will make things much easier for people to understand. Next slide, please. Couple of tips. Benno actually touched on one of those for the Insight people about being able to sign into the session. The other key thing here will help move this meeting along very quickly and efficiently is using Meet Echo to join the mic queue so we know who to call on as we have topic discussions. Other things I think are pretty self-explanatory. If you have any problems, feel free to let us know, or one of the Meet Echo or the Secretariat folks, and they'll help you out. Next slide, please. All right, so a relatively light agenda for DPROD today. We're going to do a quick update. We'll have an on-the-fly discussion of the unilateral probing draft. We had a little bit of a mix-up with getting slides submitted, but we do have the authors here to talk for a few minutes about that. And then Tim and I are just going to raise some discussion points for what we want to do next within DPRIVE itself. Any comments, questions, proposed changes to this agenda before we move on? Okay, next slide, please. So what are we working on? If you want the details, link to the data tracker. It shows you all the fun things that DPRIVE has been doing, current state of affairs, and all that fun stuff. Next, please, Alex. So where do we actually stand with the current work? The big news, I think everybody has seen the note to the mailing list. The DNS over quick document has now been moved to the RFC editor queue. So it's been approved by the ISG. I want to thank not only Sarah, Christian, and Allison for their efforts in moving this document through the working group. I also appreciate all the comments and feedback that the working group has given, and the hard work that Eric and the ISG members provided in order to get this done. So thanks to everyone. That is now, for the most part, off our plate and should be an RFC relatively soon. And then we also adopted the unilateral probing document. I'm going to let DKG talk about that for a few minutes. The big thing that I want to make sure everybody understands is that this document has actually been marked as taking the place of the unauthenticated draft that Paul and Peter were working on. So this will be the main focus of the working group moving forward. I do want to thank Paul and Peter for the effort they put into that other draft, and they were actually the ones who suggested that this one replace their work. So hopefully this will get some traction and move through quickly. With that, DKG, you want to say a few things about your draft?
Sure. Thanks. This is Daniel Gilmore. Let me see if I can share my screen with a handful of slides. Yeah, so Joey Salazar, can y'all see the slide that I'm presenting there? Sorry for the not having uploaded it earlier.
Yes,
so Joey Salazar and I put this draft together, trying to document reasonable policies that can be adopted without much coordination for the second, encrypting the second hop of the DNS traffic. I know that, as you just said, this is supersedes other drafts that were in place. We don't mean this to necessarily replace their work, but we see it as a sort of more of a formalization of the kind of work that we've been talking about. And we encourage the folks who have worked on the other drafts that this is marked officially as superseding to join us in contributing to it. So in particular, we want to think about both sides, what the recursive resolver and what the authoritative servers can do without worrying about any kind of signaling. We think the best that you can do here is protection against passive attackers. And the basic rules are, authoritative servers can listen using DOT or DOQ, and recursive resolvers can probe by authoritative IP address for DOT and DOQ and not worry about authentication failures. But doing this, of course, it adds a few concerns, specifically about the additional latency, about resource consumption on both the recursive resolvers and authoritative servers, and potentially, of course, if this doesn't work, that there will be some data leakage. So we try to provide specific guidance for what to do. We do not cover probing for DOH because of the path requirement, which makes it non-obvious as to how to see whether the authoritative server offers DOH. And we don't cover how to do signaling because, again, this is unilateral. This is something that doesn't need a signal to do. You can just try to do it. We do try to outline what kinds of signaling you would need in order to get better protection, but that's a relatively small part of the draft, and we're not attempting to define any signaling mechanisms here, or even say how you would use them specifically. The main changes that we've seen, thanks to feedback from several people on the mailing list and privately, we've adjusted some of the parameters. Obviously, the adoption is a big change, but we've adjusted some of the parameters in the proposed algorithms to be better tuned, to specifically avoid excess resource consumption and excess latency. We've tried to clarify the rationales for some of these choices, and in particular dealing with how they might interact with pools. We hope that those clarifications are useful, but maybe there are some still, I'm sure people who read this and attempt the deployment will give feedback. I hope they'll give feedback. I'm sure that they'll discover things that they understand better after deployment than they understood just from reading this. And so I want to encourage folks to try implementing this, both if you're if you're deploying an authoritative server, or if you are working on a recursor. We encourage people to try this out and give feedback to the draft about what did or didn't make sense. There's two sort of open fix-me's in the document. One of them is about how the probing policy interacts with different connections. Like, what should you do? Maybe Joe, you want to jump in and fill this in for me. I'm forgetting what the specific fix-me is, but of course, folks who can just read the document and find the fix-me. The other one is about how we imagine a signal to be combined with this. Might be nice to provide a little bit of text there, although of course, given that we don't want to define the signal itself, we can't be too specific. I think that is the main thing. This is about sort of the history of other work that's gone into this. And again, our goal here is not to claim that any of these other insights in these other drafts is wrong, but rather to provide concrete guidance to implementers. And we hope that other people who've done this kind of work will join us on this draft. So we would love to see more comments and review on the mailing list. We're doing this, it's on GitLab actually, not GitHub. So happy to have issues and pull requests or merge requests there. And of course, substantive discussion does belong on the mailing list as usual. So I think that's all of the slides. We will upload a copy of these slides to the data tracker. Apologies for not getting that to land in the right spot earlier. Paul, I see you're in the queue.
Hi, this is Paul Hoffman. So I'm one of the two co-authors on one of the previous drafts, and I want to be super clear that Peter and I don't normally speak for people, but Peter's in my other window here, are fully supportive of this draft. And for people who haven't been following or got confused because it took so long to get to this point, the main reason that we are very happy with this draft and more than ours is we could not get traction on ours from the wide audience of the working group. That is, the people who insisted on strong signaling would not contribute on weaker signaling. The people who wanted sort of mid-level signaling were not able to contribute on the higher or lower. So by going to, and so when DKG and Joey came up with this draft, we were like, oh, okay, completely different than where the working group was bringing us, but maybe this will get interest, and it obviously did. So we're really happy with it. I will contribute. My biggest thing that I would say right now is I would say that the working group is likely to only finish if we get rid of any signaling at all in this current document, if we don't even have whiffs of signaling. That is, that I believe that signaling could come later, but only after the folks who want the signaling and have figured out exactly what their requirements are, not how to do the signaling, but what is the requirement of it, which is what Ecker had gotten at initially, although he didn't run down the road too far on it. But with the ADOT document, was saying we need to figure out what level of security is needed. I would say for the current work, rip it all out. Don't even point towards a possible future, because the future could come. People could come with the new document. Peter and I are not intending to do that. We mostly went with the signaling because that's what the working group seemed to be asking for. I'll speak personally now because I'm not sure that Peter agrees, but I'm totally happy with signal free. I think that this will get us going and will lay down a good framework for anybody who feels that they want to add signaling to this. So yeah, no, we're really happy that this is happening. I have one suggestion on keeping the work going, because we obviously had a problem with that on our documents, which is that when people propose new issues on the mailing list, that either DKG or Joey add them to the GitLab issues list. I mean, people can add them on their own, but if since some people really don't like doing issues lists themselves, that the authors take any issues that appear de novo on the mailing list, stick them in GitLab, and that way we do the tracking. Because what we really, a thing that Peter and I, that came to us was we didn't have any signal, sorry for the pun there, of when issues were closed. So having them open and close on GitLab will really help on getting for the chairs to know when we're ready for a working group last call. So anyway, sorry, I've blathered on about a document that I'm no longer author on, but we are really happy with the current document. So thanks to DKG and Joey for doing that.
Thanks, Paul. I just want to say, the draft is very clear that it is deliberately not specifying signaling. I mean, the name unilateral implies that there really isn't any signaling to do. And I wanted to briefly respond, Martin, sorry, just before you step up, I see you in the queue there. Ted raises a concern in the chat about musts that are like, you must not serve different records based on the SNI. That's difficult for the client to understand or detect, right? And I wanted to explain why those kinds of musts are in this draft. This kind of draft is saying, look, this is the most straightforward way that recursive resolvers are going to do this kind of unilateral probing. And for this to work, servers need to also do this other thing, right? So in some sense, the only non-unilateral part of this proposal is assuming that both sides, the recursive resolvers and the authoritative servers, do adopt, roughly reasonable implementations there, right? That they adopt implementations that stick to these standards, then it will work. If one side doesn't hew to the standard, then the defenses against resource exhaustion, the defenses against, the assuring that records come back correctly, those start to fall away. So that's the reason why those kinds of musts are there. I agree, it is worrisome that we can't tell, but that's also true in general for DNS requests. Ed, I don't know if that fully addresses your squickiness. I'm sure parts of it still remain, but just wanted to explain why that's there. Martin, you want to go ahead?
Hi, Martin Huniek. I would like to see in this document the little bit higher recommendation to Dane over the X509. I would like to see that because of this with Dane, it's possible to do it automatically on DNS authoritative server. So it might be more useful to use Dane over the X509. I would see. I'd like to see there bigger recommendation on that.
So let me make sure that I understand, Martin, what you're asking for. I think what you're saying is you'd like to see Dane authentication of the authoritative server by name for the TLS channel itself.
Yeah, I would like to see this over the X509.
I see. So I'm not convinced that that belongs in this draft, because this draft basically, the unilateral part of it basically means that it's going to be opportunistic. And so to the extent that this draft talks about authenticating the authoritative server at all, it basically says you can try to authenticate if you like, but whatever you do, don't ignore, like, don't block the connection on the basis of authentication failure.
Yeah, I understand that, but there's also some for the smaller. I don't know how it's actually written there. That some smaller DNS servers might use a self-sign-it. So maybe also recommend there that Dane could be a better alternative to it.
I think that would belong in a draft that is not opportunistic, right? In a draft that says, you know, that tries to lock in the security guarantees, including against active attackers. That would be appropriate, and I would support it. But given that this draft doesn't lock in, I'm reluctant to have it weighed into, you know, here's a recommendation, you should do this kind of thing, because this draft doesn't even say, like, what name should the client expect, right? We're leaving that deliberately. This draft is deliberately agnostic about that, because we want to say, look, here is the way to get defense against passive monitors, right? You can do this thing, and you don't have to worry about any of the rest of it. And a recommendation, throwing a recommendation in here about how to authenticate, means that we're sort of opening the door to discussions that this draft isn't willing to contemplate. I should be clear, I am with you in the bigger picture, but I want to keep this draft simple so that people can implement it, we can get some experience, and we can see what percentage we can get protected against passive attackers just doing the simple thing. And I think that will motivate the kinds of recommendations that you're asking for in other drafts.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. Ben, I see you up in the queue.
Hey, just to emphasize DKG's point, I don't think there's any conflict here. If anything, these fit together nicely. Self-signed certificates are entirely compatible with Dane. In Dane EE mode, you can just drop the hash of that self-signed certificate into your Dane record, and now you have Dane authentication. So I think the draft is saying, here's a simple thing that you can start with, and that will set us up for future authenticated modes that are trickier to standardize.
Thanks, Ben. Eric, I see you there.
Yeah, I mean, maybe. I feel like there are two, perhaps, you know, three different framings of this document. One framing is the framing you offered a few minutes ago, DKG, namely that it's the that it's about seeing how much deployment you can get, for passive attack, right? Another framing is that it's about getting experience with, the operational pressures of having encrypted DNS to authoritative, and the third is that it's a bridge to a mode that is stronger, right? And to the extent to which it's, I guess, 1 and 2. Then yeah, it doesn't matter at all what the server is serving, but to the extent to which it's a bridge, then serving something which would be bogus is unfortunate, because it creates a new hurdle for any future signaling mechanism. So I mean, to be like, as a sort of like, not that testing is the right way to do it, but as for example, if you serve a valid certificate via whatever mechanism, then it's plausible to have some sort of HSTS type mechanism, signal in the DNS. But if you're serving a presumptively invalid certificate, then it would be unfortunate, and perhaps I think extraordinarily undesirable to have an HSTS mechanism served over like an unvalidated self-signed certificate, because then you have to worry about temporary attacks being pushed out to long-term attacks. So I guess I think I'm less sanguine with the idea of encouraging people to serve like not even in principle validatable credentials.
So Eric, I let me first say that the 3 different ways that you describe of reading the draft, I think, are all valid. Those are all things that I envision this draft as doing. And I hear your concern about encouraging things that would make things worse for future signaling. But here's the way that I'm thinking about it. This draft, I think, doesn't need to specify any particular recommendation, because to the extent that we do want to have signaling, HSTS style or whatever other kind of style, the point for that signaling is to upgrade from whatever this mechanism is. And if that signaling description says, by the way, now you need to make sure, when you're doing the signaling, you need to ensure that you are offering the following kind of certificate or following kind of authentication mechanisms. That's part of how you turn signaling on, right? And yes, I agree with you. Any HSTS style mechanism should not work over a presumptively invalid certificate. Therefore, if that's a signaling mechanism that we choose, you simply haven't achieved that if you haven't given a validated certificate. I think we can defer that authentication question to whatever signaling draft we put in place after this. I'm hoping that we will get to that point. Does that make sense?
I think it makes sense. I'm not sure I agree strategically, but I'm not sure. But I think getting something is better than nothing. So I'll be quiet for now.
Okay, I'm happy to talk with you more later if you want to strategize about these kind of problems. I care about that too.
Yeah, I think all I'm trying to say is, like, I don't want us to get into a bad equilibrium where everybody has self-signed search which they have no way to bootstrap up, and then the the 2 open questions really are about any kind of mechanism like this. One, whether or not, like, the sort of operational aspects of running the of having all your formerly DO53 traffic turned on to like dot or doke are prohibitive, and I've heard a bunch of complaints about that. And the second is, like, what are the operational aspects of having actually serving a valid credential, right? And so my fear is that we get in this equilibrium where people feel comfortable serving TLS in general, but then they're like, well, it's like actually having a valid credential is prohibitive, and so then we can't bootstrap up. So that's so how we get there, I don't know, but that's my concern.
The main gotcha that I hear in the scenario that you describe is where it is not possible to change the authentication credential. Right, where somehow people feel like they've gotten used to serving it in this unilateral way, with whatever weak authentication is, and then they decide they want to go more secure, and they find that they are trapped because if they try to change the credential that they offer, they run the risk of DOSing themselves, right?
No, I don't think that's not quite what I mean. I mean, maybe, but I guess what I'm saying is, I feel like the history of deployment on the web, there was a lot of talk for a long time about how you should do self-signed certificates, right? And there was a feeling that it was too hard to get WebAPI valid credentials, and that it turned out not to be the case, obviously, after some work. But I'm just potentially concerned about having people feel like they've done all the work and then having a new barrier to have to climb, and people aren't willing to climb that barrier. But again, I think you're proposing a valid deployment theory. I'm just not sure I share it, but I'm happy if people are enthusiastic about this one. I think let's go with it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think this is one step, and we're looking to climb a bunch of steps eventually. And I think helping people climb the one step first, and then have another step to take. I think that's the right way to go. But we'll see what happens. Paul, you're next.
So thank you to Eric for the 3 purposes. I would very much like to say that I think that the third purpose, this is, that this draft is going to act as a bridge to the future one, should be completely out of scope and not done. There should be, and because Eric brought this up a few months ago, and I thought it was a really good discussion on the list. There should be nothing in this draft or in the draft that we adopt, that gets out of the working group. There should be nothing in that document that prevents any sane, fully authenticated system from being deployed. So absolutely no prevention. But there should not be any feeling that this is a bridge towards one or many of them, because it will turn into a bridge towards one but not the others and such. And so that goes exactly to what Eric was saying with the, well, if people already have self-signed certs, then they may feel like they don't want to go up to the next level. That desire to go up to the next level is what needs to be motivating for the whatever the document is. So I would really like to see us not try to bridge, but very actively try not to block. And the exact point here is, Ecker was saying, well, if people just have self-signed certs, that's not good. We should try to get them to have real certs. But we don't know what the name is. We've had discussions on the list of what name do you put in a cert for a server that has 100,000 names, or what name do you put in the cert? Should it be an IP address or things like that? Until we have that discussion, I believe the world is better off with people putting in obviously self-signed certs with crappy identities in them. That will shine a light on this is not meant for that next thing over there. So I'm happy with it, but I would love to see Ecker's trilogy, or at least the first two parts of Ecker's trilogy, clearly reflected up front in the document of these are the design goals. And it might be okay to say as a design goal, we don't want to get in the way of future things. That's sort of a tautology because you never want to get in the way of future things, but it might be worth, at least bowing in that direction.
Thank you, Paul. It looks like the queue is drained to me. I don't want to steal more time from the working group than we need. So I think I'm going to step away from the mic and stop sharing. Thank you for the discussion, and I look forward to more comments. Yeah.
Thank DKG. Yep, that's the right one, Alex. Thanks. So the last topic on the agenda, and this is kind of more to spur discussion on the mailing list, but with the adoption of unilateral probing, what we're really looking at here is the last milestone that the working group has identified. Alex, I think there's one more slide. If you could jump to that. Yeah. So we've completed the work on the confidentiality between stubs and resolvers, and we've been talking about doing both unauthenticated and authenticated work or connections between the recursive and the authoritative servers. It seems that at this point we're really kind of focused on more of the unauthenticated as the time being, and waiting on what to do for the authenticated side. So the key thing here is to really kind of focus the working group on getting this document, get it quality reviews, get some iterations, encourage some implementation, so that we can understand what's going on with the functions defined in the document. So, and that one more slide, Alex. So with those existing milestones, we originally had a milestone for developing the requirements. We tried that. The working group didn't seem to be all that interested in it, so it's been marked as abandoned. The milestone focusing on the solution for adding confidentiality to exchanges with the authoritative servers. We think that the unilateral probing draft is going to provide that functionality, and so we really want to focus there. And then at one point we had a milestone that talked about defining and collecting and publishing performance data for measuring the effectiveness of DPRIVE published technologies. Tim and I had a discussion about this, and we were struggling to figure out, who in the working group would be, really interested in doing those kinds of measurements and being able to structure it in a way that gave us useful data. And we really didn't come up with a great answer. So we're actually suggesting that perhaps Tim and I go and talk to the MapRG chairs, because this seems to be far more in their bailiwick of expertise in doing these types of measurements. The one thing I will say here is that, you know, because we were talking about the performance against pervasive monitoring, we would just probably want to, you know, get that point across, that it's not just measuring, you know, traffic to and from servers. It's really measuring more of the capabilities to, you know, prevent that kind of pervasive monitoring. So what this really means is, you know, right now, Tim and I see the working group as being tightly focused on getting unilateral probing, you know, moved through the process and out the door, so that we can start seeing some deployments and some experimentation. So if anybody has comments on that, we have a couple minutes left. Otherwise, we'll probably focus on moving the discussion to the mailing list. Paul.
Paul Hoffman. So one minor comment is on number 2. I know that our charter says experimental. I didn't agree with it at the time. I don't agree with it now. The current draft is definitely protocol-like. I don't think of it as an experiment. We've heard that there is interest both on resolver side and on authoritative server side of doing it once it's moving forward. I don't think we need to change the charter at this point, but as unilateral probing goes into towards working group last call, it's currently marked as informational, which is particularly inappropriate. I would like to see this just be on standards track. There will be more implementation of this than many other working groups have for some of their standards track documents. I don't see any reason to call this experimental, as long as still at that time there are a couple of resolvers and a couple of authoritative servers and a couple of operators who are doing it.
Yeah, so experimental actually came from the original formulation of the charter, and so I kind of see that as the minimal bar. If the working group thinks that it is standard track, that's not going to force us into a recharter or forcing it to be experimental. It will be what the working group thinks it should be. Alex.
Thank you, Alex Meyerhofer. I want to make a comment on the third point on collecting performance data and effectiveness of the technologies. I think that is a nice, that could be a nice outcome of the MapRG working group. And I want to remind people that we still have an experimental RFC about the padding policy. You remember that DKG back then did like a single measurement study about what the appropriate padding size would be, and I converted it in a document. And that outcome of number 3 could actually be good input to like a revision of that document with updated security properties of the padding sizes. And my question is then, where would you do that then, as soon as we have the results from MapRG? And the other thing is, if we ever do authenticated resolver to recursive, where do we stuff that work?
So that would actually be in dprive. It's like right now we don't have a proposal in the working group. So you know what Tim and I would like to do is really focus on getting unilateral probing draft done. If you could you actually post a link to that draft you mentioned for the measurements to the mailing list? That may spur some conversations and maybe encourage.
Yeah, I will.
Thanks. And if there are people interested in doing those measurements and participating, then you know we can revisit that. But I think the big thing is that we haven't seen anybody really standing up and saying they're interested in doing that kind of measurements. But those are both good points, Alex. Thanks. Eric.
Yeah, thanks. We can debate this later, but I just want to register that I would not be in favor of taking a lot of propane to pro standard. I think it's a good idea, but that doesn't mean it should be pro standard.
Okay. Yeah, it's like I said, it's a discussion for the working group and in conjunction with our AD to see what makes the most sense for the status. All right, any other comments before we wrap up? All right, hearing nothing, I want to thank everyone for attending, both in person and virtual. I hope everyone was able to get useful information out of it. I also want to thank Benno and Alex for being our hands-on on site, and hopefully we will maybe actually have like a real in-person meeting the next time around. And with that, I'm going to wrap up and say thanks for attending DPRIVE and stand by for the ADD meeting. Thanks all.
Hey, whoever's got control, can you transfer over to me, please? That'd be Glenn.
You probably would need to share the slides then yourself, because I'm not a delegate. Can you transfer the control, Glenn?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I will stop.
Okay,
I can revoke that. Yeah, Glenn, there you go.
Excellent, thank you. Got it, Benno. Well, there's a new version of this. How do I get that uploaded? Fresh. One slide there. It's confusing. Chair slides are named very similar.
Foreseen that.
How do you get the slides that are being shown to refresh?
Yeah, one moment. I can throw them away. Refresh. AD chair slides. Okay.
The chair slide should have
So,
a sixth slide, but the one that are currently active only have 5.
So I refreshed the documents and uploaded the ADD chair slides. Can you reopen them?
Let me try that. I did the refresh too, and it didn't seem to affect the slides that were in the system, but let me try again. Oh, that seems to have done it. Thank you, sir.
This one. Yeah, exactly. Thanks.
Okay, for those who are waiting for ADD, we will start at 15 minutes past the hour. So you have a couple minutes to grab a coffee or whatever you need to get you through the next session. And I promise the folks that are remote in California that we won't start before 15 minutes past the hour, so they didn't have to get up too early. The sun's just coming up here.
Do you happen to have the 10 numbers for the NLF Labs bank account?
Yeah, if you can find it. Okay.
Okay, at least Tommy, we were originally scheduled at I think 2 a.m. California time. So this is the better slot. We did good. I think it was 2 a.m. on Friday.
But that's why my working group got scheduled at 2 a.m. on Friday.
Whoa, I'm sorry. Oh, that's terrible. And if anybody from DeepRive is still on here, I see that we got a set of slides proposed by Dan Gilmore for unilateral probing that need approval from, I guess, you guys, but they're in the ADD queue. Okay, I show 7:16. Shall we get started with ADD? Is my my awesome co-chair around?
Right here. Hello,
Hey, Mr. Lawrence.
everybody. Sun's actually up here, but not for long. It's actually quite a crappy day, but that's probably all you need to know.
Well, welcome to ADD at IETF 113. I'm Glenn Dean, one of your co-chairs. Of course, this meeting is conducted under the NoteWell from the IETF. Please be aware of it and follow it. And we really, really mean it. You know, we carry this slide over from the last session because last meetings I thought was really great. You know, we are kind to each other here, and we respect each other in our words and our actions. As I said, I'm Glenn Dean. I'm from Comcast NBC Universal. I'm one of the co-chairs. Mr. Lawrence, you want to introduce yourself?
Dave Lawrence. Probably anybody here already knows both me and Glenn, so I don't think any further introductions are needed.
Well, there's one, Eric Mink, our area director, who's awesome. So first order of business, we have 3 drafts currently that have been out there in working group last call. These are the 3 of them listed. Let me start at the bottom. The DNS binding mapping for DNS service binding mapping for DNS service. Only on cut number 3 of copy today, so I'm still waking up. That one has not really received any negative comments or any changes requested on the list. So I think we can go ahead and call that one as passing working group last call. That brings us to the other 2 drafts. There have been a lot of comments flying around DNR from both Ben and Chris, especially. And I see today some discussion on lists about some sort of changes or small editorial comments about priority flowing over into DDR. So I'm wondering, do the various editors for those documents want to make any comments about where they think we're at with regard to this? And Tommy, I see you're in the queue.
Yes, thank you. So we do have 2 open issues on DDR. They are both what I would consider to be, pretty editorial, but they don't change the protocol fundamentally. One is about explaining kind of NX domain behavior around resolver.arpa, and the other one is what was discussed on list today about, hey, we should give a call out to DNR. So I think that's all the feedback we have. Based on that, I would say that the next state for this should be kind of like last call close, but we need another revision, right? So we'll come out with another revision, and then it could go on to kind of the Shepherd write-up from there. But I don't have any problems getting that next copy out in the next week or so.
Okay, thanks, Tommy. That's sort of my feel on it too. Mr. Lawrence, do you have any different opinion on this one?
We're all on the same page.
Okay, so then that brings us to DNR. Are Chris Box around in the queue? Want to make any comment? Tiru, I see you're in the queue as well. Potentially, do you want to make some comments about where you guys think we're at with this draft and the various changes that have been proposed?
Yeah, we just posted the changes today, and I see that we have addressed all the comments from Chris except the one that Ben had raised, which is with regard to NDP, and we had posted and questioned back to the six-man working group. I have not seen any response. I see Ben added his clarification regarding RFC 4861. I think only after that feedback we will be able to update this option. So we have an external dependency, and if we don't get a response, maybe the JS can intervene and help us get some experts in a six-man working group to respond what is the right way of whether we need an implicit service priority or an explicit service priority. So I think that's the one that needs some more discussion, and we need some clarity from the other working group. The other one I see just now Ben had posted saying it's not alias mode, but rather a mode in which only the ADN is published and the rest all feeds will be ignored. So I think we'll have to think about it and get back to him. So I think those are the only two pending comments that I really collect need to be addressed.
Okay, and I see Chris Box is in queue. Chris?
Hello. So yeah, there have been a flurry of activity on the list. So most of those have been accepted, I think. So there are a couple of areas where I'd like to hear from other people in the working group if they've got opinions on it. I'm not sure. So if we don't hear any, then yeah, maybe the next step is issue a revision, and then people can talk about that.
Okay. So then I guess to summarize that, and I realized also that I forgot to call for a scribe for our notes. So we'll get to that in a second. But to summarize the conversation, I'll capture these in the notes. So number 3 is past working group. On number 1, we're pretty much ready. There's just the 2 edits that are going to go in, and then it's ready for passing on to the Shepherd. And then on number 2, we've got a few outstanding issues with six-man and stuff like that, and whatnot to resolve. But it looks like we're in pretty good shape to have that closed off fairly soon. Is that an accurate reading? Does anybody have an issue with that sort of summary? Okay. Now, with that, can we have somebody volunteer to take notes? And in particular, let me clarify that we need somebody to take basic notes, not to like verbatim notes.
I can do that. I'm just looking for the notes. Alex here.
Great.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Alex.
Who was that? Oh, Alex. Thank you, Alex.
I'm just quickly taking notes of the last conversation, and then so moving on. Let's go to the agenda. What did we do?
Should I add that to the ADD notes or to the debrief notes?
They're actually one and the same. If you go down farther in the ADD notes, you'll see it. Where is the agenda? See the chair slides. Where's the agenda? Does it not pull up the agenda?
I got it. I'm gonna add it to the debrief notes because I think that the other one is canceled, and so I got it.
Alex, you have to be a bit closer to the mic when you're talking.
I'm all set for note taking, so go ahead.
Hello, I'm back. Meetecho crashed on my browser.
Okay, Glenn, I said I'm ready for note taking, so you can go ahead. I didn't know that
Okay.
the browser crashed. Yeah.
I'm looking for, the agenda deck does not get automatically loaded.
Sorry.
The markdown agenda is, I don't see that in the list of decks to share. Here, I can share it off my screen directly then.
Okay, I can share Split Horizon.
So, yeah, okay, so let's do this. So the very first one will be Tiru, Europe for Split Horizon DNS. Do you want me to show the slides, or do you want me to drive?
Slides.
Say again, please.
Dan will do the slides.
Yeah, so
Okay.
Glenn, I'm presenting that, Dan Wing, but go ahead and show the slides. That'd be great.
Well, actually, I just passed you control, Dan. Is that good enough?
That's good enough. They seem to be sharing.
Yes.
They are sharing.
Oh, sweet. So I am Dan Wing. One of the changes we made to Split DNS was had Ben Schwartz join us as an editor and contributor to the document. So let me run through some of the changes we've had from the last IETF meeting until now. There was an allowance previously for NSEC that's been removed to tighten up the domain camping that we're trying to avoid, and also remove the subdomain of NS allowance that we had, which was more complicated than necessary for the solutions that we're trying to aim for. Ben also added a section on DNS-based validation, and we've had a slew of editorial changes that make doing a diff more complicated. During the interim, one of the things that we uncovered was some slight confusion on the scope for the document, that it doesn't allow domain filtering, and that's correct. It doesn't. It's only intended to work with a domain that you already own, and we can verify by talking to a public name server or by doing DNSSEC validation. So we added a small scope sentence to the document, and we might even start talking about tweaking the title to a verified split horizon as well. And then as a, these graphics didn't work out well. Sorry about that. As a reminder of how the protocol works, we're doing PVD and DNR, which is up in the blue, to get everything started. So that's not new. What this draft is proposing is the validation that happens at the bottom. So what's shown there is talking to a public name server. Similarly, we can validate by checking with DNSSEC, which doesn't require going out to a public DNS server and asking it the question. But in both cases, with what we're doing in the green section for the split horizon, is verifying the ownership is legit. You know, that the local DNS claiming to own this zone really does have delegation for that zone from the public name servers. And I'd really like to have some discussion. We've had some good discussion at the interim. We had some good discussion on the mailing list, but certainly things in person are good. looking for adoption, as well as comments on the content. Perhaps most interestingly or most important are the secure validation mechanisms that we have in the document now sufficient for everyone's needs? Do we need to add more? Do we need fewer? The same, the typical, we don't want too many standards to solve one problem issue, but we want to make sure that we cover the use cases that folks are concerned about and interested in. That's all I have for slides.
I'm looking for my browser window. Here we are. Any questions or discussion around this? Mr. Lawrence, you want to manage the queue?
Yes, Ben Schwartz is in the queue.
You bet. Well, Ben was, and then he dropped.
Hi.
Okay, he's back now.
Hi, Ben Schwartz. You mentioned the title. I think that's a really good point. I would go a little further even. I think that maybe this would all be a little clearer in terms of its purpose if we change the title to something like validating local claims of authority, because that's really what this draft is about. This is about situations where some local entity claims that they are authoritative, that they have authority over some zone, and you want to check that claim. And then we present in the draft different mechanisms that you could use to validate that local claim, combining a bunch of different technologies that have come up in this working group. The draft, I think, still references provisioning domains as the example of where you would get these claims from, but actually there are already other standards out there that do this. In fact, there's even an ancient DHCP option that allows the local DHCP server to claim authority over a particular set of domains. No matter where the claim came from, this draft describes some mechanisms that a client could use to validate it.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ben. Martin, please.
Hi, Martin Huniak. I would like to mention two things. One, that in the process, there is the requirement that name servers had to match between the step 1 and step 10, I think. What if they are in a real split horizon when the addresses don't match because there are, for example, internal addresses used? There's one question. I don't know if I have this right. And the second one, it seems to me that it's quite a complex process. As I understand it, there is first some DNR, then detection of the domain, then downloading JSON through HTTPS. Also don't know if I read it correctly. I don't think every DNS had to also run on HTTPS. Wouldn't it be possible to do it by a record placed inside the zone, for example, SRV or TXT, eventually the CNAMEs to other zones?
So yes, it might be possible to do that, and that's why we're asking if there's other secure mechanisms that we could use, and propose text, and we can add that. The reason that we have the two mechanisms we have there today, remember what was shown on that one slide in green is not this document. It's just how the information is conveyed to the client. So PBD is in there, and those steps are not part of what we're extending or creating or defining with this document. It's just those last steps, which is going out to the public DNS and asking for the name server for the claimed local zone that the local name server is claiming ownership of. and checking to see if the public DNS agrees that that is supposed to be delegated down to this name, down to the claimed name server on the local network. That's the only thing that we're adding, as well as doing the same steps that DNSSEC. And yes, that does mean that the local name server needs to somehow get that authority from the public DNS that it owns that zone. And how it does that and where it does that and when it does that is its own problem, and not something that we specify in the document.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. Ecker, please.
Howdy, I have several questions about actual practicality. The first is, as I understand it from the discussion we had previously, in many cases, enterprises do not wish to disclose the existence or non-existence of certain domains. So, say I have mail.example.com, but I want to hide the existence of corp.example.com. In that case, it seems to me this mechanism will not work. Am I correct about that?
You would have to disclose that you have example.com. You would not have to disclose mail.example.com.
Okay, I think I'm going to need you to walk me through that, because as I understand it, so let's take the version of 4.1.1, right? If I guess maybe it depends on how you think the name servers work. So I mean, I'm imagining a situation where I have two names, where I have like one name server, which is like my external names are hosted by like say DreamHost, and my internal name server is like hosted internally on some local resolver. And so when the public resolver goes to resolve corp.example.com, what answer is it going to give? What is it going to get? It's going to get the internal. It's going to get the internal resolver, right? But how does that disclose these as the corp.example.com? And my point is, an NS record for NS record like of one NS record for example.com that points to DreamHost. But then when I try to resolve corp, what happens?
When you try to resolve the internal one that is not published publicly, you'll get an NX domain or some other failure.
And so NX domain is considered sufficient to demonstrate that it should be resolved locally?
No.
Then I don't understand how this works.
Okay.
Ben, are you joining to add clarification?
You're muted, Ben.
Oh, thank you. Attempt to clarify. In the architecture you're describing, essentially, yes. The existence of corp.example.com, if it's delegated separately from the rest of example.com, the existence of corp.example.com becomes a matter of public record. But the domains underneath it do not.
Okay, I have no personal problem. Sorry, go ahead.
So, and that, I think, is, in my view, that is an entirely workable and reasonable architecture. Generally, the existence of corp.example.com is not a secret, but people might have then thousands of names underneath it that they would rather not resolve publicly.
So I personally agree with you. However, that was not the impression I got from the previous discussion in the discussion in that last ad hoc meeting. The second question I had, and I'm sorry, like I did review this draft previously, but I sort of like lost, I sort of lost the plot a little bit. Are you assuming that there is that the internal resolver is identified by domain name, and that you have to make a secure connection to that internal resolver, or is internal resolver potentially identifiable purely by IP address, and you make a 253 connection to it?
By name.
Okay. Thank you.
Tommy Pauly, please.
Hello. Just following on the conversation Ecker and Ben were having, I just wanted to ask to clarify. in that corp.example.com case, you could also very reasonably just have example.com. So like I joined a network and it says I get all of example.com because I am the company that owns example.com and I have lots of private stuff here. And there's also public things. And in that case, if the delegation is for all of example.com, I would just end up resolving both the internal and external things to that encrypted resolver on my local network, and that's presumably okay. Is that how it would work?
Yes. And that was the example that's on slide 5 that got corrupted during the Michu upload. But it's also the example that's in the specification.
Welcome back, Ecker.
That does work correctly because then what? Because as I understand it, the way this works is that the public name server responds with the name of someone to contact, and so now you're replicating the names both internally and externally, but the glue records. This just seems like actually quite a complicated solution to have like the idea of who the name server is, for example.com, be different externally and internally.
Great, thank you. And that was the queue.
All right, thank you. Dan, can you pass control back over, please?
Should have it now.
Thank you so much, sir. Okay, so the next item on our agenda is the network policy to use network designated DNS resolvers. Who's talking to this one? I'll pass you control. Kira, is it you?
Yeah.
All right. Control be handed off to you. You have it, sir.
Okay. Can you see the slides?
Yes, we do.
Okay, great. Yeah. Yeah, I'm Thiru from Akamai. So this draft is the problem that this draft is trying to solve is there are several networks which wants endpoints to use network signal resolvers, but unfortunately they don't have any mechanism to inform the endpoint about this network policy. If this network policy is not informed, and let's say the endpoint is using, let's say, a non-network signal resolver, it could cause various adverse effects like security alerts or blocking the client entirely, or it could be quarantining the client. So we were looking at ways to solve that problem beyond using the extended error codes if the client is directly reaching some other resolver using an IP address or other mechanisms. For that, what we have done is we have picked the explicit web PVD, very similar to what the split horizon DNS does, which basically gives you extra additional information of the network. And in that, we have added two new keys. One is the key to indicate that the policy allows only using network signaled DNS resolvers. And the reason why, and code basically to indicate the reason why it wants the endpoint to use its the network signal resolver and not some other resolver. A very simplistic example is this web PVD is giving various information about prefixes, when these prefixes expire and what is the identifier. It's also giving additional PVDs that we're introducing in this draft, which is to say that it's requesting the endpoints to use the network signal resolver and then internal security policy because it wants the endpoints to use the network provider resolver. And the signal is just a feedback. Basically, it's an internal security policy expression by the operator of the network, and it's definitely not a policy prescription. The endpoints can definitely ignore and try to use public resolvers if they're reachable, and they can continue to establish communication. We are currently proposing it as a strictly opt-in for explicitly trusted networks by the end user, It could be used in any network. It would also be used in, let's say, enterprise networks without MDM, for example. Nowadays, we are seeing various types of BOD devices with a very lightweight host agent, which only conveys the posture assessment back to the enterprise network, and we don't have a fully managed MDM kind of a device. So in those kind of devices where we don't have a configuration profile or an MDM, this would also be quite useful. Any comments and suggestions are welcome, whether this is the right working group for this, or do you think there's interest to solve this problem?
Polly, please.
All right. Thank you. So I had one comment on the use and interpretation of a provisioning domain here, which is that it seems a little odd for this provisioning domain to tell you don't use another resolver, because using another resolver implies that the device is essentially using another provisioning domain, because a provisioning domain is the set of all of the configuration, like IP addresses and prefixes and DNS server. So, you know, even if my system is choosing to use other DNS resolvers for particular use cases, it still has the provisioning domain defined for this network as the one with the network resolver. And that always should be the case. So I think it's, the problem I have here is in how do I interpret this? Because let's say I have another provisioning domain, which is a VPN that I'm using. That VPN has its own DNS resolver. Since one of my PVDs told me, don't use any other DNS other than mine, should I now say, like, I'm not allowed to use VPN, or I'm not allowed to use my cellular network, which has its own DNS? Like, it gets a bit complicated. And perhaps, you know, if we wanted to go down this route, it would be better to express it as a upfront claim that, by the way, this network will intentionally try to block traffic to known public resolvers, or to VPNs, or to proxies, or essentially telling you up front, here is the kind of adversarial security stance you're going to encounter on this network, rather than telling a device, oh, you shouldn't use someone else's DNS, because that interpretation seems to be much fuzzier.
Okay, so you're saying just add a flag to indicate that, and we're good to go.
Okay, was that it, Tommy? It looks like it. Ben, please.
Hey, as I said on the mailing list, that I don't like this general direction. I think that this draft is really trying to fix a problem that isn't fixable, and it's trying to work in a space that I think is not where we should be focusing our efforts, and not where the future of secure networking is. You talked a little bit about lightweight host agents as an alternative to MDM. You know, the behavior that I'm seeing more commonly is partitioned device state, where the device has an MDM inside a contained profile that is separate from other profiles. So you could call this, I guess you could call this BYOD if you want, but actually the network only ever interacts with a container that is effectively a fully managed device. So it's not really BYOD in the way that we usually talk about it. It's a secure network where only fully managed devices or contexts can access the network. And in that context, we don't need any of this, because the network administrators have total control over the network configuration inside that container.
Yeah, I agree, Ben. I mean, if you have a BOD device with a container which is a split configuration profile, which is fully managed MDM, you don't require that. But this use case is specifically for networks where you don't have that kind of configuration profile specific MDM.
Great. Thank you, Martin.
Martin Huniek. I would like to point out one thing I think is quite important. I think that any other, for example, DOH third-party resolver should be opt-in by definition, not opt-out. So if this is the case, then we would not need some signaling that use only this DNS. Because usually, at my point of view, you don't have, in most of the cases, you won't have any benefits running third-party DNS in the first place. There might be some cases when there's a censorship or DNS some filtering or something like this, but it should be the user should be the one which says the computer to use other DNS. And if so, then there should be no way how to block a user from doing so. Some implementation, like I think Mozilla, which activates that by default, the third party, I think it would be even harmful to user privacy by giving the information of a resolution to the third party, which wouldn't have this information in the first place. So I think it's important to somehow state that make some even a recommendation RFC about using those third parties in the first place, and then maybe solve the issue of signaling that okay, don't use it. If there will be no willing to update such recommendations or do such recommendations, then yes, we probably need some standard form of signaling of not using third parties. But I think it should be first opt-in.
Yeah, whether that's a good comment, Rosa. I mean, whether it's opt-in or opt-out, what we have seen is we have seen endpoints joining enterprise networks with using third-party resolvers. We don't know whether the user has explicitly configured its use or it was a preloaded software which came with a pre-built third-party resolver that it was hard-coded and allowed to use. But then with all these middle boxes and DNS filtering, we are forced to basically block those. And what we are seeing is the end user basically seeing that it's unable to connect to the internet, and that's causing lots of turmoil and concerns with regard to not able to use the enterprise networks. And if you see any DNS filtering, enterprise DNS filtering service that you see today has a policy which is basically categorizing some of these non-network provided resolvers as anonymous resolvers and blocking them. But I see that as an half-baked solution. It's not fully solving the problem that it's actually causing the endpoint to degrade to DNS over 53. And that's the whole reason this draft talks about that. Hey, if somebody's downgrading, you prompt the user and let the user make a choice if it wants to connect to the encrypted resolves provided by the network, whether it's a trusted network or not, and then make a call whether this blocking by the network is something that the user is willing to agree and fall back to clear text DNS, or wants to just abandon this network because it doesn't trust the network and wants to do connect to some other network. But it's basically trying to empower the user, because what is happening at the network is just happening in a one way without giving a hint to the user on why it's not able to reach this resolvers, whether it's because the server is down or my routes are down, or is it because the network is blocking it. That's the feedback it is giving back to the user.
Okay, I just
and what an user or end implementation would do is it empowers the endpoint and the user to make right choices after that.
Okay, I just wanted to say that it should be a good. It would be a good idea to do some kind of recommendation or even a BCP for this usage of these third parties. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Martin and Tiru. Lorenzo, you are the last for this draft.
Hey, Lorenzo Colivi. Yeah, I'm sort of a little bit confused why, what effect this might have, right? Like in general, like devices will default to the network provided DNS resolvers. If they don't do that, it's usually because they have a reason not to do it. and that reason might be an application that wants to use its own DNS resolver, and or the user configured it to use a different DNS resolver. In none of those cases will such a hint help. It will just basically tell the device what it already knows, that this network doesn't meet its security requirements, and present the choice to the user. The device already has to deal with any network that blocks these third-party resolvers without using this option. And it doesn't seem like having this option would be any sort of meaningful improvement in security or user experience or anything, really, because the choices that are presented to the owner of the device are the same, regardless of whether it's blocked intentionally or not. It doesn't work, and so the user has to decide whether fallback is appropriate. Right? So I don't see why having a hint would be useful.
Yeah, it could be that. Yeah, I mean, if it's blocked and if there's an alternative that the user wants to pick, because let's say some resolver is not reachable versus a network actively blocking it, is a quite different scenario, which is probably fixable after a few seconds if there's a router flap or my routes are not up. But this is saying that if you join the network, it's blocked indefinitely.
Okay, thank you, Lorenzo and Tiru, and back to you, Glenn.
Well, not for very long. Tiru, you are up again. You have one more slide set to present, so why don't you just keep control?
Sure.
The next topic is DNS resolver info, the draft. And Tiru, you have 10 minutes plus some discussion time.
Sure. Yeah, I'll keep it short. I mean, this draft was discussed several times in the working group in the past. There was a lot of feedback that we got on this draft, but at the time, the high priority was to make progress on DNR and DDR, and this draft took a backseat. So we're trying to bring it back to the, just remind the working group of this work and whether we want to adapt this work, because at that time we had addressed all the comments from the working group. So this was basically introduced because we had in our charter that we would like to provide more information about the DNS resolver beyond what's being conveyed with the discovery mechanisms that are there. And that would probably help the client in making a selection decision. I mean, we already have two mechanisms for discovering DNS resolvers, but we don't have a mechanism to discover what is the appropriate interesting DNS resolver information, and that functionality is missing, and that's what this draft is trying to provide. So what we have done as part of this draft is introduce a new resource record type called resinfo. It could be either used with DNR or DDR. With DNR, it would be used with the domain name, and with DDR, it would be used with the resolver.arpa, and we're basically retaining structured JSON. And we have defined several feeds based on the discussions that we had working in the working group to remove several ones which were not agreed upon, and we stuck to a minimal set of fields that there was strong consensus at that point of time. And there are two mechanisms basically that this draft talks about. Either after you establish a secure connection, you can download this resolver information from the encrypted DNS server, or it could be prior to establishing the DNS connection. You could do, if you have the local DNSSEC validation enabled, you could use DNSSEC as well to make sure no one tampers this data. So basically, the current list of discovered information is basically whether the resolver supports QNAME minimization, whether it has support for extended DNS error codes, whether it requires any client authentication or not, and an URL that points to a generic constructed resolver information. It could have the various HTTP status error codes. It would return whom to contact for troubleshooting, and the DOH API is supported, and an URL that points to a human-friendly description of the resolver identity. And we could add a lot more information based on the discussion in the working group. And we request an adoption for this draft, and any comments on this draft are welcome.
Hi, Ben Schwartz. I think we should probably adopt this draft. I think of this as finally a replacement for the like weird chaos zone bind dot version thing, or like various other weird implementation specific resolver configuration info records that different implementations have kind of put out there in on squatting on different names. I feel like, you know, there's proof that people want that kind of information, and we should provide a more standard way to do it. I'm not exactly sure that the specific metadata mentioned in this draft is what we want to present, but I think some mechanism like this is worthwhile, and this is a good enough starting point.
Yeah. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you, Ben. DKG?
Dennis, I'm Gilmore.
It's hard to hear you.
Sorry, is this any better?
Yep, better.
I can see Ben's point about we should probably adopt something like this just so there is a standard way to do it. I want to flag two specific concerns. One of them is that reporting lots of details about a given machine's configuration in other contexts has caused concerns, right? I believe, for example, a lot of web servers are reluctant to report things like the version of the web server that they're running, even though they used to do that. So that typically, I think, is for security concerns. But in this, thank you for going to this slide. This slide in particular, I'm concerned about the bindings between the URLs here and the actual service. Now, what's to stop me from pointing to a URL that describes some other server and people using that to make a decision? I feel like this is there's some really sort of problematic dynamics here. If this discovered information is actually used to select a resolver, I don't even know how you know that you're getting the resolver that these URLs describe. And that seems like an issue. I also am very reluctant to include this required client authentication, just because client authentication for DNS resolvers is not generally currently done. And you know, the idea that somebody has a list of every DNS lookup that I made associated with me personally is pretty troubling. So these are my main caveats about the data that's being offered here. But I agree that if we're going to define something, it's worth having it in this group.
That's good feedback. Thanks, Daniel. I think I get your point with regard to, I think you're referring to an attack where an malicious DNS server basically points to an URL which takes you to somewhere with regard to some bad feedback to the user in prompting to do something which would damage the endpoint's poster. I get that attack. Is that the one you're referring to?
My concern is more that, like, I set up my own resolver. I know that, say, Cloudflare publishes some policies which people are generally fine with. I set up my own resolver, and in the discovered information, I say, oh, by the way, you can check out details about my resolver. You can see that it's, and I just point to Cloudflare's data. So someone looking at the pieces of information is like, oh yeah, that's Cloudflare, I'll use that. But it's not, it's actually my server.
Got it, thanks.
Thank you, DKG. Ecker, please.
Yeah, I think the key point actually is the one that DKG just made a second ago, which is it's not actually that the terms that Cloudflare offers are great. It's that you look and you're like, oh, it's Cloudflare. This is totally cromulent, right? Because like obviously you could just copy the terms, right? I think if so, I think I would especially expand on this in two ways. One is anybody going to use them? And I guess I'd like to ask, like, which client providers seem likely to report this data in any meaningful way to the user? I don't believe we would, and I guess I'd like to, I don't see Tanya Polly's here, maybe Tanya Jensen's here. Maybe they could talk about whether they'd be interested in providing this to users, because we can publish as much data as we want, but if no one's going to surface it, then it's not worth doing. Second, I think that the point DKG made, I think makes really clear that like it has to be that there has to be some cryptographic binding between the published information and the server itself, as opposed to merely a simple assertion. So I guess I'll be more excited about adopting this if I hear from someone who says that we'd use it.
Sure.
Great. Thank you, Ecker. Puneet, please.
Hi, Puneet here from Google. I think extending some of the comments just made, I would say it makes sense to separate out the information which is provided into two parts. One is purely protocol specific, like whether QNAME is supported, EDE is supported, etc. And any other information which is more policy like the URLs or anything else. Maybe even two separate endpoints or two separate RR types for them, just to separate them out. And in terms of implementation, I would say maybe for the protocol features, we look at extending EDNS 0 to encapsulate that information. And I can share more thoughts there on the list itself.
Thanks, Puneet.
Great. Thank you, Puneet. And Glenn, that looks like that was the cue.
Well, thank you, Chiru. Could you pass control back over to myself, please?
Yes.
And the next one we're going to have up is Ben Schwartz. And Ben, let me pass control over to you so you can present. I don't see Ben in the queue. Did Ben drop off? Okay. Thank you, Ben.
Hello? Okay,
all
this should be quick. So this is about an individual draft that is from me and Chris Box, although it's based on observations made by a lot of other people who've thought about the problem of how DDR acts with good old-fashioned local DNS forwarders on your home router and that sort of thing. As a reminder, this is the situation we're talking about. You have a client with a local network IP address. They're talking to a DNS forwarder. They were told, you know, your DNS server is at this local IP address. It's actually, they don't know this necessarily, but it's actually just a forwarder to some upstream recursive, probably operated by an ISP. A lot of ISPs have set up encrypted resolver support, which is great, but these clients aren't able to access it because DDR's default upgrade rules say that the IP address has to match in this case, and effectively it can't match, and you can't prove cryptographically, you can't prove ownership of a private IP address. So could we get DNS over TLS here? And what this draft does is it describes, it's purely informational because it describes a client policy. And clients have all kinds of very strong opinions about what their resolver selection policies should look like. So this draft doesn't attempt to tell anybody what they ought to do. It just tries to go through and describe a client policy that would upgrade in this situation, or really a family of client policies that would be able to upgrade in this situation, and also identifies some of the problems that come up when you try to do that, and also offers or describes some mitigations that apply to those problems, although don't necessarily totally resolve them. And ultimately the judgment of which of these problems are relevant, which of these mitigations are sufficient, this draft doesn't address that and leaves that in the hands of essentially client implementers to consider. But it does try to describe in detail what the consequences are likely to be. So this has been presented here before. It hasn't really changed since the last IETF. One change that's been valuable is that the DDR draft language has been slightly adjusted so that it's clear that the DDR default client policy is not the only policy that's allowed. That's now very clear in the DDR draft. And we're seeking adoption here for this draft. Thanks.
Thanks, Ben. And let me make a couple comments on the adoption. So the main concern the chairs have expressed was that this particular draft has had.
You're on the air.
Glenn was.
Yeah,
Glenn, are you done saying what you were saying?
No.
Sorry, could you repeat that? I had my audio set up wrong.
Okay, man. I was going to say that the chair's main concern with the adoption call was that it had little discussion on the list. So that's why, Ben presented here today. He's put some stuff on the list. I think we're ready to issue the adoption call, but it would be really great to hear from the members of the ADD family on their thoughts on this draft. So I guess, Ben, the short answer is we will be issuing the adoption call soon. And we look forward to hearing what people think.
Okay, thank you. Thierry, please.
Hey, Ben. I've reviewed the draft, and it's a good start, and I definitely support adapting it. But I had several concerns on some of the deployment models that you had captured in, especially if you go back to the slide where talking about the legacy router not being upgradable to support the OHTTP servers. I see two types of legacy servers that are always there. Legacy servers whose firmware could be updated versus legacy routers whose firmware cannot be updated, and this seems to be supporting both the cases. And the third one is basically, hey, the ISP can manage the home router and it can change the configuration, in which case this draft is not required. Right, and covering the threat models in all these cases, and especially one security considerations that I saw, this mitigation this draft talks about was the two mitigations that it talks about was basically one relying on a TRR. I was wondering how this would scale with so many diverse TRRs being used by browsers and operating systems. How would this be deployable? And the second one was with regard to relying on end user. Empowering end user is something great, but my bigger concern is what if let's say there's a phishing attack and an attacker shows me an resolver identity which looks and feels like it's provided by, let's say, Comcast, right? And that would basically the end user would be assuming it's connecting to Comcast ISP resolver, and but in fact connecting to an phishing or a malicious DNS encrypted DNS resolver. And how do you plan to address these issues?
Thanks, Chiru. That's a lot of different things. I'm not sure that that I can track them all and respond to all those points, but I'll try. On the topic of upgradability, I think there's a lot of subtlety there. There's, for example, it may be possible to change the configuration of certain routers, but not really add major new features like TLS termination. So probably we can't just expect routers to just add support for TLS. That would leave the only thing that they could do would be to synthesize a null, an NX domain or a no data DDR response, which doesn't help. So let's see. On the topic of user interactive mitigations, I think, as I said, this draft is informational. It's not designed to recommend particular behaviors here. If you think there's a concern, some of these mitigations are really essentially impractical or irrelevant, we could remove them, but otherwise we're just trying to be descriptive here. I do think that the attack you described is not something that seriously concerns me, because any attacker who's in a position to do anything like that would equally be in a position to simply prevent DDR altogether, leaving the user sending their DNS in clear text and leaving the attacker in full control of the DNS stream. So in general, clients shouldn't, if the client is encrypting their DNS traffic and sending it to a DNS server that they can identify but don't know anything about, that shouldn't change the client or user agent's threat posture in any way. They still don't know whether they're talking to the attacker. So So I don't see a big difference there.
Sure.
Martin?
Yes, Martin, please.
Martin, hi. I would like to have a question about this private IP thing for changing the policy of the client. How this would actually work with the v6 when there is no typical private address there? Shouldn't be there some kind of policy of matching prefixes or something like this? Also, with the private IPv4 address, I suppose that it would it's referring to the first hop DNS resolver, not when the resolver has public IP address and the forwarding resolver does not.
Hi. I'm sorry, I actually lost connection for a couple seconds while you were speaking. But I think I can answer your question, but if I get it wrong, maybe you can repeat some. So this draft, the concept in this draft, it describes cases where the DNS, the local DNS forwarder is identified by a non-public IP address. That is obviously very common in IPv4 networks. It is definitely somewhat less common in IPv6 networks. It is not ruled out in IPv6 networks. IPv6 gateways that are operating the forwarder are free to use a local IP address, a link local, or there's a few different IPv6 non-public ranges. And I believe that's well supported, relatively common. So that's always an option. Otherwise, the recommendations, or sorry, they're not recommendations. It's you know, it's a little delicate, but the situation where this applies is logically applicable to each advertised DNS server independently. That is, DDR applies to each server separately rather than to the collection of advertised servers. So on dual stack networks, this will apply to the IPv4 resolvers, even if somehow some of the resolvers like IPv6 resolvers are not eligible. And then again, it's a matter of client policy to figure out, well, I have several different resolvers. I was able to do DDR for some of them, but not others. You know, how does that influence the way I send queries?
Okay, thank you very much. And I do have also one point to DDR itself. I know it's probably a little bit too late, but why the DDR itself uses the resolver.arpa when there is probably the PVD that would allow to use something like underscore resolver.pvd domain. This would allow a DNSSEC validation of this information. And also, DDR seems to solve the detection of DOH problem with the path. Wouldn't it be better to update RFC 8484 to limit the path to something like uniform URL? Sorry. Also, I've seen in DDR a draft DOT with a different port. Is it wise to allow different port in the DDR? Thank you very much.
So for the path and port comments, you might want to take those to the comments on the service B DNS draft, which the chair has just closed the last call on, but that's where those are specified. I can speak to those topics, but maybe the chairs should tell me how much time we have.
We actually have enough time, but we do have 2 more people in the queue. So,
okay. So briefly, I'll say that I think the path component issue is fundamentally there because DOE was already specified and widely deployed, with path components. So there are many DO resolvers already out there that have a specified path, and we wanted to make sure that it was possible to specify those DO servers in the DDR context. For the port number, the port number specification is something that is optional for clients. So, and it's up to every client to decide whether they support this. But it's especially useful when running many different servers on the services that need to be disambiguated. Instead of, if you're trying to, for example, run DNS servers with different behaviors, you can share an IP address and run them on different port numbers. And it's also helpful in other contexts related to DNS, where non-standard port numbers are an issue. But maybe we should talk more about that.
Yeah, I think at this point, we are getting near the end of the session. I'd like to get Tommy and Eric in the queue. So thank you, Martin. And please continue on the list or as necessary, out of band. Thank you. Tommy, please.
Let's see. Okay. Yeah, I agree with Ben's points to those last questions. We can help explain what's there, but I don't think those aspects are going to change. I think those are the right calls. So Ben, on your draft, I appreciate that it's not normative, but I'm wondering if in section 3 that defines this relaxed validation policy, we may want to be a bit more prescriptive, not necessarily normative, but it essentially just says it defines the client policy as you just use opportunistic and you just try it. And it points to the fact that this kind of validation can be valuable when combined with some of the mitigations. But I wonder if we should have a bit stronger of a recommendation to say that, no, really, you need to go and read the security considerations below and you need to think about the mitigations. I'm just a bit concerned someone would read it and say, oh, look, they've defined a policy where I can just use whatever I get back from this DNS record willy-nilly. And I don't think we should indicate that that would not be a good idea, even if we don't make it normative.
Yeah, it's a little unclear to me whether normative language is allowed in informational documents.
I'm not suggesting making it normative necessarily. We just say, like, you would have a bad privacy time, and you're probably making a wrong decision if you don't have a mitigation.
Right. Speaking with only a partial hat on, I will say that I personally am in favor of it. However, when I've tried to do it, I've also been pointed out by other people in the ITF that not so fast. So it is an unresolved point.
Okay. I think that we can definitely incorporate Tommy's feedback here and improve the warning about sharp edges. Eric?
Eric, you have the mic, but you might be muted locally. Eric, please come back. Eric Nygren is back. Okay, yes. Now unmute yourself. There he is. Oh, what's going on there, Eric?
Well, maybe it's time for JabberScribe.
Yeah, permissions issues he's having. So, was it going to be your question? No, probably not.
Nope, he just went offline. He may be back in a second, so why don't we give him a second to join back? Does anybody else
Yep.
want to jump into the queue while we wait for Eric to return?
Nope, we're not accepting anybody else in the queue, Glenn. Oh, it looks like Eric is going to work this time. Yes, we hear you.
Woohoo! Following up on some of the conversation in the chat, I think it's worth looking into the IPv6 side of this a little more, and in particular, doing some more review of what's actually in what's used in practice here. There may be a lot of. It seems likely that a common use case will be for to use the the gateway address, which would be a public address in the same /64 as the client as the resolver. And if that's a very, very common scenario, it may be worth having some guidance around those common IPv6 scenarios so we don't get stuck there or not work in some of the commonly deployed IPv6 only networks.
Hopefully not the same /64.
No, a very common case would be the same /64 as the client.
Huh. That's definitely not in keeping with the IPv6 group guidance for ISPs.
But I think this is one where it's worth looking at. It's worth looking at what do clients support and what our ISPs tend to deploy, and then based upon that, seeing what to use.
I think that we have we have kind of a more fundamental problem of trying to figure out what it would mean to essentially validate the locality of a public address. If I have a DNS server identified by a public IP address, DDR's baseline logic says, well, it's a public IP address. They could get a certificate to prove control of it. And essentially the questions that we end up with here are things like, well, what if I could prove that I'm so close to this address that I'm just as good a judge of its authenticity as anybody? And so we've had suggestions on the list, for example, about like, well, could you use the hop count? Could you, set your TTL to 2 and ping it and see if you can reach it? And then, that's close enough. I think we haven't seen any of those that seem, I think, plausible enough that they would be deployable. So my question, to flip your question around, would be, okay, that's, the common deployment practice maybe is to use a public IP address there, but how hard would it be to just, also drop a link local address into the DHCP or into the IPv6 RA?
Well, the link local introduces a whole bunch of scope issues that I think there's a question on how will clients support those. And it's unclear what the security property, how the security properties between a link local versus a on link in the same /64 differ.
Yeah. So there's a difference between link local and on link, right? Depending on how your network is structured, the router's IP address might not actually be in the same neighbor discovery collision segment as the client or whatever. But anyway, I think this is certainly, if we can find reasonable ideas here, this is definitely something that we can incorporate.
Great. Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Ben. Over to you, Glenn, for the wrap up.
Yeah, hi, everybody. So great session today. ADD is always a place where people talk and exchange ideas, and it's been pretty awesome. I want to say, reflecting just for a second, we started out as, and I can't remember if we've ever actually met in person for ADD. I remember we had several BOFs before we went live, but I kind of think we did all of the last 2 years and all these drafts, all virtual. And so I just kind of want to thank the authors and all the commenters and everybody who's been along for the last 2 years of this ride, we've got a couple documents that are pretty much ready for working group last call or in working group last call and about to move forward. So well done, everybody. So thank you for all the time and effort people have put into ADD the last 2 years, all online. That's amazing. So we'll see you in Philly. That's the next destination, I guess, for ADD. And we'll see you in July. Be well, everybody. The meeting is ended.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is some.
Yeah, right. I'm not sure I got all of Eric's comments, but that's like my usual. As a non-native speaker, it's challenging. But he can edit them themselves.
Yeah.
Fair enough.